March 17, 1943. The runway at Rechlin was a strip of gray under a winter sun, and the wind moved across it like a quiet warning. In the left seat of a captured American bomber, a German test pilot steadied his hand and wrote the first line in a new logbook. The airplane around him smelled of oil and canvas and unfamiliar paint. Through the glass, he could see the Luftwaffe ground crew stepping back, their faces made small by distance and by the scale of the machine. He pushed the throttles and felt 4 Wright Cyclone engines answer with a deep, even thunder. The cockpit trembled. The runway began to reel itself toward the tail. Up came the nose, and a Boeing B-17, an American flying Fortress in German markings, lifted into the sky. He knew the code the Luftwaffe had given her, DL+XC once, later other ciphers, but the Americans had named her first. Wolf Hound, the ground crew at Molesworth had painted on the nose in script that was almost jaunty. The name remained like a ghost beneath the Balkenkreuz. In the months that followed, what those pilots and engineers learned from this airplane would shake assumptions harder than any defeat on the ground. It would teach them that their enemy had not simply built a weapon. Their enemy had built a system. The story had begun 3 months earlier, on December 12, 1942, under a low winter sky in occupied France. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger flew B-17F serial 4124585 on a mission against the marshalling yards near Rouen-Sotteville. 20 fortresses of the 303rd Bomb Group droned east in tight formation, silver islands in a cold sea of cloud. The men were still new to this work. Hell's Angels, famous now, then still learning what could be asked of a bomber and the crews inside it. The Luftwaffe came for them with the blunt certainty of experience. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-1190s slid down out of the sun and scissored in from every angle that might break apart the box. The first attacks tore holes in aluminum and flesh. The second made those holes into decisions. One engine on Wolf Hound coughed itself to silence, its prop windmilling like a pinwheel. Another smoked and sagged. The formation kept moving, because that is what formations must do, and Wolf Hound fell behind into the cold. To turn for England with failing engines was to die over the channel. To aim for Sweden or Switzerland was to wish on a map. Flickinger looked through hurt air and found a field near Melun, a rough strip of earth, barely field at all. He pinned the ship to the ground on her belly, carving a furrow through winter grass and wet soil. When the metal stopped shrieking, the crew stepped out with their hands high, expecting captivity. They did not expect what their airplane would become. German soldiers and technicians arrived as if conjured. They fenced off the field as though it were an excavation site, photographing, measuring, sketching. This was not wreckage to be carted off in crates. This was a complete living specimen. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had an intact flying fortress, intact enough to ferry, intact enough to fly. Within 2 days, patched and refueled, the bomber wore black crosses and a swastika on the tail. A pair of Bf-110s eased into formation on her flanks, and the captured ship began a cautious, heavily briefed hop north. Even so, somebody shot at her. Somebody always does. Recognition signals flashed, radios hammered, and the guns fell silent. She reached Rechlin with more stories in her skin than she had left England with. Rechlin was a place built to decode other people's ideas. If Farnborough was Britain's quiet brain and Wright Field was America's, Rechlin was Germany's, part laboratory, part proving ground, and part confession booth where an enemy machine could be persuaded to tell the truth. Panels came off in sheets. Rivets were counted. The thickness of the skin was measured with calipers and argued over in clipped voices. Engineers traced wiring looms like veins. They weighed armor plate. They tapped fuel tanks and watched the rubber pucker and self-seal. And they wrote in notebooks that this, too, had been done well. The deeper they looked, the less the airplane seemed like a singular marvel, and the more it looked like evidence. It was not just that parts were strong, it was that parts were standard. A spar built in Seattle mated perfectly to a section built in Long Beach. A bracket stamped in Burbank fit without the caress of a file. Jigs and fixtures, templates and workflows, an entire philosophy of good enough quickly had been baked into the bones. German aircraft were the work of craftsmen. American aircraft were the work of factories. That difference is aesthetic until it is war. When at last the bomber flew for the Luftwaffe, Germany's test pilots discovered that the rumors they had dismissed were not rumors at all. The B-17 handled with a steadiness that made formation flying almost natural. She could be flown with an engine gone and another dying and still hold altitude long enough to make a choice about where to fall. At 25,000 feet and beyond, she worked in air where flak grew imprecise and time stretched between burst and shrapnel. And everywhere a pilot looked from outside, there was a gun. The B-17F carried 9 50-caliber Browning machine guns as standard. The next variant, the G, would add more and bring the count to 13. The Luftwaffe mapped the arcs like cartographers of danger. Tail stinger straight back, top turret sweeping like a lighthouse, waist guns crossing the beams, the ball turret below, a glass and steel planet with its own gravity. In isolation, a gun is a device. In formation, each gun is a piece of an argument. A squadron box of 9 airplanes could create a space in the sky where any fighter entering would be intersected by multiple arcs of fire. Multiply that box by 3 for a group. Multiply again for a wing. The numbers stopped being numbers and became a kind of weather. Tracers everywhere, like sleet. They turned the captured fortress into a lesson. Fighters made mock runs at every angle, while cameras clicked and streaks of light scribbled through the frames. The old doctrine, go in from 6 o'clock and stay there, was revealed as a ritual of self-destruction. The tail of a fortress was not a gap, it was a funnel. Even the steady-handed veterans felt the pressure of those seconds when closure narrowed from a few thousand yards to a few hundred and then 100, and the world reduced to the colored rings of a gun sight and the instinct to live. The best attacks came from the front, high at 12 o'clock, where the nose of an F model had fewer dedicated guns and where the bomber's great glass eye made for a tragically vulnerable target. Courage and timing together could split a formation like a wedge. But courage has limits when the target is growing bigger at a combined closing speed past 500 miles an hour, and timing fails when nerves do. As the spring wore into summer, the Luftwaffe learned everything the fortress could teach from the inside out. They ran engines against the clock, charted supercharger efficiency by altitude, and wrote neat tables that turned fuel into miles. They weighed ammunition loads and asked practical questions. How long can each gun truly sustain fire? How hot do barrels go before discipline must stand in for metal? And all the while, another set of men asked a larger question that the airplane could not help them answer. It was the question of arithmetic, because when intelligence officers added up production reports from Boeing, Douglas, and Vega, the answers looked like a misprint. Dozens of fortresses per week from a single plant. Hundreds per month across 3. 12,731 by the end of it, with the most prolific year seeing hundreds leave the line every 30 days. Meanwhile, Heinkel's troubled He, 177, staggered along a far narrower pipeline. Germany could build brilliance. It could not build in bulk. The bomber went on tour, exhibited alongside other captured Allied types at Luftwaffe airfields, where officers could touch what they would face, or what they could not. A B-24 set a different American silhouette. Longer wings, deeper belly, the same implacable purpose. A P-47 showed what happens when ruggedness and horsepower are given free rein. A P-51 hinted at a future in which the bombers would no longer fly alone across the heart of the Reich. British machines stood there too. The Lancaster, immense and purposeful. The Mosquito, Smooth Wood, and Speed. Typhoons and Spitfires that had been sculpted by a different island's priorities. Men walked along the captured B-17, and, even if they did not have the words for it, understood that they were not simply looking at airplanes. They were looking at factories made visible. When Wolf Hound's pure test value had been largely wrung out, she went to Rangsdorf to fly with the most secret unit in the Luftwaffe, KG-200, the Chameleons and Phantoms. There the paint grew darker, the codes changed again, and the missions began to blur into murmurs. A captured fortress could be a door into enemy airspace at night, when radar screens and controllers' voices grew complacent at the shape and speed of what they thought they saw. She could tow a glider too, though Germany's airborne ambitions had already bled out on rocky islands and at river crossings. She could carry things and people where other machines would be challenged to go, and she did, in twos and threes, to places that the record does not illuminate. More fortresses arrived over time, belly-landed in Denmark, or slid to a stop in French fields, flown out by test pilots who had learned the language of American cockpits without a teacher. Each brought new production changes to catalog, a new twist in wiring to note, a new reinforcement in armor to measure. Each confirmed the same essential truth. This airplane had been built to be strong, to be simple to maintain by men with modest training, to be made and remade in volume and at speed. They kept practicing the attacks, because practice was the one thing they could control. Head-on passes remained the most effective, and the aces who mastered them wrote their names in long strings on the side of their cowls. But the Americans kept changing too. The B-17G's chin turret appeared, the distinctive bulge under the nose with two 50s staring forward. And suddenly, the cleanest approach was bracketed by more fire. Pilots adapted, tried steeper dives from above where elevation limits made it hard for the turret to follow, or slid underneath from the low 12, hoping to duck both chin and ball. Others, their wings heavy with unguided Werfer granite rockets, loosed explosives from beyond the reach of machine guns in hopes the bursts would shatter a combat box by shock and panic. The rockets were crude and draggy, and the fighters that carried them were slow to climb back into the fight. When P-47s and then P-51s with the range to go, the distance showed up in numbers, the rocket carriers became prey. The arithmetic did not relent. Even when tactics worked, the sums did not. A B-17 could require 20 20mm hits to kill from astern, and a pilot's accuracy at wartime closure and deflection might be 2%. Ammunition counts became a curse. You could fire and be out before you were through. Meanwhile, each bomber carried thousands of rounds and dozens of gunners, and they did not have to be expert marksmen. They only had to be there, and many of them were. Courage fixed part of that. Practice fixed another. Nothing fixed the fact that while Germany tried to teach each new pilot how to live long enough to learn, America sent its survivors home to teach large classes in safety. One system bled experience. The other banked it. In the test rooms and briefing huts, respect grew. Not sentimental respect. The respect a professional grants an adversary who has solved the problem differently and solved it thoroughly. The B-17 was not graceful. It was not a knife fighter. It was a platform with a purpose. Climb high, fly straight when ordered, turn when the box turned, open the bomb doors on time, close them, and come home if you can. Everything about it, oxygen pipes and intercom headsets, relay panels and circuit breakers, armor around the pilots' backs and the tanks' bellies, was there to make that purpose more likely. And when you multiplied that single likelihood by 27 airplanes, and then by 81, and then by 300, the odds began to look like fate. The ground war could hide from airplanes only by dispersal and deception. The air war could hide from arithmetic only by ending. By 1944, the bomber streams were long black wakes in the upper air, and the escorts swarmed in such numbers that the sky around a German fighter could feel like a narrowing funnel. German pilots flew until they were exhausted, until they were dead, or until someone finally told them to stop because the fuel was gone. American crews flew a number and went home, and the ones who made it taught the next ones how to make it too. The Luftwaffe still had masters, men who could carve away a fortress from a formation while under fire and live to do it again. But far more often, it had novices with a few hours of combat time and a too-short story, if ItStep. There was one man at Rechlin who represents the whole strange intimacy of flying the enemy's airplane. It was the test pilot who slid into Wolf Hound's cockpit at the beginning. He approached captured aircraft like puzzles, not prizes, and he survived them all. He learned the American throttle logic by feel. He guessed at pressures in pounds per square inch, not kilogram per square centimeter, and watched the needles to confirm he'd guessed right. He sat in the ball turret once, just to understand what it demanded of the kid who lived there for hours at a time. Knees jammed, breath thin, seeing the world upside down with 2 guns for companions and a parachute too big to share the space. He never forgot the sensation. The world turning around you because you were the center of a small sphere, and your job was to keep the larger sphere, the formation, intact. There is a way to tell this story as a parade of technical marvels. The computing sites, the constant speed propellers, the self-sealing tanks, the modular spars. There is another way to tell it as a litany of battles and raids and losses. But the truest way, the one that the people at Rechlin learned reluctantly, is to tell it as a story about factories and railheads and managers and what a nation chooses to value when it decides to turn itself into a machine. The Flying Fortress, with its 13 guns and its 7,500 rounds and its 30 tons of aluminum and steel, was a machine. The thing that built it was a system. That system made 300,000 aircraft of all kinds and tens of thousands of tanks, and filled warehouses with ammunition measured not by crates, but by billions. In that light, the single airplane at Rechlin was not a secret to be unlocked. It was a signal. In the last year of the war, many of the captured fortresses still in Germany were knocked out on the ground by the very sort of raids they had once flown in. Others simply ran out of parts and patience. A few flew strange missions until near the end, coded with KG-200's identifiers and disappearing into night. Wolf Hound itself met her end in April 1945 on a bomb-pocked airfield, as though the sky had come back to claim what had been borrowed. The test pilot, who had flown her and so many others, lived to write about it when peace made it safe to speak in full sentences again. His account is not an elegy and not quite a lament. It reads like a ledger, written by a man who has tallied everything and knows what the sum means. He praises what deserves praise and refuses to pretend that skill can outrun structure indefinitely. He makes clear that the B-17's guns saved lives by the thousands, that the interlocking fields of fire were not a boast, but a design, that the crews inside those big cold machines were not merely passengers of doctrine, but the reason doctrine worked. He also makes clear that once the war became a contest of production and replacement, the question was not whether the bombing would continue, but how many raids it would take to make continuation irrelevant. Picture, for a moment, the scene that so many German fighter pilots described, the approach to a formation from the front. The fortress you have chosen is growing in your windscreen, its nose glass bright, its props a shimmering disk, its chin guns already flickering, the top turret turning, the cheek windows alive with the quick, jerky movement of men tracking you. The closure rate is absurd. Your own guns are ready, and you count down the distance by instinct. Now, 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 break. Sometimes your shells walk across the cockpit, and the bomber folds down like a man with both knees broken. Sometimes the top turret reaches you before your finger does. Sometimes you do not break in time. And always, behind that one bomber, there are more. If you stand on a German airfield in the summer of 1943, you can watch knowledge travel. It moves from the test bays to the classroom, from the classroom to the line pilots, from the line pilots back to the test bays in after-action reports thick with detail and thin with comfort. The reports change tactics. They make aces more lethal. They save some lives. They do not change what the crews at Rechlin already sensed the first day they walked the length of Wolf Hound's wing and saw the rivet lines run straight and true off the edge. Their enemy had built a world in which an airplane was not a marvel but an outcome. By the end, the air above Germany is loud and empty at the same time, loud with engines and bombs and the snap of rifle-caliber flak, and the whip-crack of 20 mm shells, and the heavy cough of 30 mm. Empty of illusions. Cities are mapped by their smoke. Rail lines are measured by the gaps where bridges used to be. Oil is something you coax out of the ground, and then pray stays liquid on its way to the tanks that will not be fueled anyway, because the tracks are twisted steel. The Luftwaffe still fights. The fortresses still come. The escorts multiply like arguments that need no persuasion anymore, and so the story returns to that March morning at Rechlin when the logbook opened and a captured bomber with a borrowed name climbed into the pale air. The pilot felt how steady the airplane was. He learned how it bled energy and how it kept it, when it would forgive and when it would not. He learned the reach of its guns and the patience of its engines. He learned, as everyone there did, that a weapon can be both a marvel and a message. The marvel was in the engineering, redundancy layered on simplicity, strength balanced against weight, a cockpit arranged to reduce a crew's mistakes. The message was not on the instrument panel. It was written in factories thousands of miles away, in schedules and shifts and supply chains. It said, "We can do this today, and we can do it again tomorrow, and again, and again." There is a kind of inevitability that only looks inevitable in hindsight. To the men inside those formations, each mission was a roll of dice in a sky where luck and skill and planning and fear all had their say. To the men attacking them, every pass could be the one that ended a life. And sometimes that life was their own. In rooms far from the sound of engines, numbers accumulated until they spoke louder than pilots could. And when the sound finally stopped in May 1945, what remained of Wolf Hound and her sisters, American and German, captured and reclaimed, lay scattered across fields and airstrips, their stories spent. But if you listen close in that last silence, you can still hear the lesson that an engineer at Rechlin might have written in the margin of a report after the day's tests were done. It would not be poetry. It would be a line of prose as clean and hard as a machined edge. The guns on the B-17 are impressive. The system that built the B-17 is decisive.